Hello, thank you for being here today. I'm Anja of the University of Osnabrück in Germany, and I'm going to talk to you about the literary motif of losing an animal companion in 21st century British children's fiction. So what is this motif? In the mid-20th century, this was a very common motif in children's animal stories, and this is a study by Kathleen R. Johnson on how this motif operates in especially American stories. And she found that while on the surface such stories often promote respect for other animals, underneath the surface we still have a very strong speciesist ideology. And that these stories basically, this is a quote now, reinforce anthropocentric elements that limit the genre's potential for questioning conventional boundaries, separating humans from the rest of nature, end quote. So there's a standard pattern to this motif. First of all, we have a child insecure of their own self and their role in peer group and family that bonds with an animal. The interaction with this animal then helps the child to overcome its insecurity and to integrate. Then the animal dies or is lost in some other way. The child then has to overcome the bond with this animal in order to reintegrate into human society and to learn that human-human bonds are actually more important than a human-animal bond. Sometimes this is so strongly reinforced that the child actually has to kill the animal in order to learn this lesson. So this is how this motif operates in the 20th century. Now what I want to do is to present some examples of this motif, now not in 20th century American stories, but in 21st century British stories, and see if and how this changed. This is my first example, Jill Lewis's Skyhawk of 2011, which is the story of a Scottish boy, Callum, who befriends a wounded osprey, Iris. After the protagonist Callum has lost his human friend, Iona, the bird serves as a placeholder and as a medium to channel grief until he can build a new, meaningful human relationship with an African girl, Geneva. And the central animal loss scene here is that shortly before Geneva arrives at the Scottish village to meet Callum in person for the very first time, Iris, the osprey, is lost in a storm. What we have here is a scene of a very short-lived shock. Callum appears to be devastated at the first glance, but this soon disappears, and human concerns are signposted as more important. So the reader is clearly supposed to enjoy a moment of triumph when Geneva appears, even though Callum at that point thinks Iris is dead. There's a virtual overkill of positively connoted birds, all laughing and shouting, cheering and clapping again. Iris is completely absent from this scene. What we have here is basically a victory of the classic white savior narrative. Male Scottish boy has saved black female girl, Geneva. Iris, the osprey, was merely the mediator. A second interesting aspect of this is that Geneva, the human girl, is connoted with realness. She is really there. Callum is struck by how real she is. So what does this leave for the bird? There are actually two spaces that Iris, the osprey, can still occupy in this story: the digital and the symbolic. Regarding loss, there's something these two spaces have in common, namely that something lost in these spaces can always be recovered. Lost data, for example, and symbolic value can never really be lost. So the basic idea is that losing Iona, the human, first dead human friend, this is final. But losing the animal is never a final state. The animal can always be retrieved, can always be brought back, and can always be reused for other anthropocentric uses. like bridging Calais to Geneva. So very strong instrumentalization of the animal here in Skyhawk. My second example is Pes Todes, The Last Wild, part of a trilogy set in the future in which almost all animals have died out. At the bottom of this story, we basically have a human exceptionalist master narrative, rather reminiscent of Kipling's Mowgli stories in the Jungle Books and parts. The boy Kester can't talk to other humans, but he can speak the language of the animals. There's a categorical human-animal divide we have here, and Kester, as a human who can speak animal, has a certain power, voice, it's called in the story. He can command the animals, and leadership just naturally gravitates to him, even though he is a 12-year-old boy who's never seen a forest before. The death of an animal companion primarily serves as a test of his leadership skills. Kester is responsible for the girl Sydney and her cat, girl Polly and her cat Sydney, that way around, falling into a waterfall. Polly gets out, Sydney doesn't. The narrative focus, focalized through Kester's eyes, is almost exclusively on Polly, to the point that Kester doesn't even notice that Sydney is lost until his animal companions tell him. Even when he notices and is devastated, the pronoun use, her cat, for example, shows that he does not really grieve for Sydney as an individual. Losing Sydney is just a form of failing Polly. In the end, the entire scene boils down to Kester learning about responsibility and learning about what really matters. What really matters, we learn in this scene, is on the one hand the greater good, and on the other hand that it's okay that saving one's own is more important than saving others. So Sydney's death is mainly just instrumentalized as a testing ground for the boy's leadership skills here. My next example is Ross Welford's Time Traveling with a Hamster, where the lost animal companion mainly serves as a commodity. Story is of a boy, Al, who goes back in time to rescue his father from death. And he takes his hamster with him. Alan Shearer is the hamster's name, though the hamster is rather a mascot than a companion. On the final journey into the past, however, he only sends a letter and the hamster, he doesn't go himself. Sending the hamster is quite interesting. It's completely unnecessary for the plot in a way, because his dad would already know through the letter that this is Al sending him the message. So the protagonist appears to be kind of unconsciously aware of this classic catalyzing function of the companion animal. Al has found his agency through time travel. He doesn't need the hamster anymore as a catalyst. His father in the past, far more timid than he is, does need him. There's no sense of loss at all in this scene. After a brief goodbye, Al just flippantly reflects that the hamster seems happy enough in this time machine. So no emotional bonding with the animal. In the process, the hamster also loses all importance as an individual. Later on in this scene, he is apparently not even worth mentioning anymore when Al reflects that the garden tub, that's the time machine, is gone along with its contents. Returning to the house in the now, changed due to his letter, he finds that his formerly dead father is now alive and kicking, or rather alive and breeding hamsters. So the original hamster is long dead, but this doesn't matter at all. The hamster has not only been reproduced through breeding, it has been multiplied, copied. The implication is that there's a virtual endless number of possible Alan Shearers to have, while there's only one dad. The focus on breeding as a sport to win trophies with nondescript animals in innumerable little cages also leaves a kind of bitter aftertaste of utter commodification. This hamster doesn't matter at all as an animal. I'll now turn to a somewhat different example, Catherine Rundell's The Wolf Wilder, where we have the lost animal as an emotional token. The Wolf Wilder tells the story of the girl Theo who rewilds wolves. The central animal loss scene in this book follows a rather classical pattern on a first glance. The protagonist makes a mistake, thinking she's better off without her human companions, and that mistake is immediately punished through the death of an animal companion, her beloved wolf Grey. So animal death once again serves as a warning shot in a way, that if she continues on this path, she will lose more important things, meaning here her mom. Human-human companionship is actually repeatedly highlighted discursively as more important than human-animal companionship. Even when Theo is with her 3 wolf companions, narrative voice tells us that she is alone, or that there was only her. In the moment of Gray's death, the wolf is also not defined for what she was as a lupine person, but through what she symbolically means for Theo in human terms, her mother's favorite wolf. During the quite prolonged death scene, there are 2 more phrasings in which Gray is defined primarily through what she is for Theo's relationship to her mom. Gray's death thus becomes a symbol for Theo letting down her mom, and in that way loses importance as Gray's death. Nonetheless, there is real loss in this scene, not just surrogate loss. Theo thinks it was like watching a forest burn, like watching an army fall when she sees Gray die. And this scene is actually the most emotionally intense in the entire book. Theo also reflects on Gray as an individual, thinking about what Gray liked and what she didn't like. She liked snow, she wouldn't like tears. And finally, and most importantly perhaps, Gray is not simply supplanted by another wolf who takes her place like the multiplying Alan Shearers in Time Traveling with a Hamster. When Gray is lost forever, and there will never be another Gray. My final example is Jas Butterworth's Where the Wilderness Lives, where we have a literal case of losing an animal. The children lose their dog Willow, who is taken to the pound. For the main protagonist, Kara, losing Willow means literally losing a part of the family. She is first and primarily worried about Willow's feelings, not about the feelings of her siblings about Willow. She's worried that Willow might be scared, that she might feel deserted. So we have a strong sense of individualism with the character of Willow. Nonetheless, the book constructs a contemporary British society in which even a little girl immediately realizes that the emotional state of her dog will not mean anything to the adults around her. So Kara frequently and deliberately resorts to anthropocentric discourses to make the adults listen, repeatedly stating that the dog has a function as her brother's service dog. The status of the dog is hence completely different in this book, but the function of the motif curiously remains much the same. In the end, losing Willow is a wake-up call for Kara, that she needs to take action herself because adults will fail her. Losing Willow turns out to be the only catastrophe in her life that she can do something about. So this becomes the starting point for her journey of discovering her agency. Once she has successfully managed to break Willow out of the pound, she becomes more sure of herself, and she then also starts to take care for what is signposted as more important issues in her life, like coping with bullying at school. Main difference, however, to how the motif is used in 20th century stories is that here losing Willow is not important. She can regain Willow. Willow's still there at the end of the story. So she's not a catalyst that is used up and then gone. Willow can remain with Kara, and Kara can still mature. This paper is too short to go into detail, but I just want to use my final minutes to sketch some point of interest on this motif. First of all, I think the motif is mainly just as it always was, an author's sleight of hand to confront the protagonist with loss and grief and responsibility without sacrificing a more valuable human character. The lost animal characters are still mainly flat characters that also do not stand for themselves or do not stand for themselves exclusively. They stand for other humans or they stand for abstract concepts. So the animal companion is in a way always exploited as a shell carrying some other meaning. The master narrative behind these stories is still always the one of a child learning. And the animal is tied to childhood, belongs to the past in a way, and adult future is still connected to other humans rather than to the animal. But I think there's still a glimpse of hope for the activist, in the way that we see that the animal characters are now being treated more as individuals. So what we have here is definitely a motif in flux right now, and I'm eagerly awaiting new children's books to see how this trope continues to develop. Thank you for your attention.